Pnawn da a chroeso i'r weithdy. Good afternoon and welcome to the workshop. My name is Carolyn Wallace and I'm based at the University of South Wales and Prime Centre Wales, and also the Wales School for Social Prescribing Research. David?
Hello, I'm David Pontin. I'm the Narin Bevan Chair for Community Health at University of South Wales, and I'm also a member of all those groups Carolyn just mentioned.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan Elliott. I'm the Senior Research Assistant for the Wales School for Social Prescribing Research and based at University of South Wales.
Could we have the first slide, please? Thank you. And the next one. Thank you. So the workshop aim is to provide an opportunity to explore the 6 steps of group concept mapping based on a paper that we published on social prescribing, where we used 2 consensus methods. The first was group concept mapping and the second was a World Cafe method. And it was, as it says, to develop the learning needs framework for practitioners in Wales, because as you possibly know, social prescribing has a very little evidence base to it, and one of the gaps in our knowledge had been around what social prescribers, i.e. community connectors or link workers, needed to learn throughout their roles. So during this workshop, we're going to demonstrate the use of group concept mapping for exploring health and care research, but using this paper as a benchmark throughout, so that we can explain the process to you. Next slide, please. So what is group concept mapping? So it's an integrated participatory mixed method approach, which enables groups of participants to organise and represent their ideas. And as David commonly says, it is a martini method: anytime, any place, anywhere. Meaning that, so what was that?
For the younger listeners.
That's for the yes, of course, yeah. So it helps participants to clearly define the concepts. It can be used for example, we've used it in the past to develop the concept of family resilience. We've used it for evaluation and decision making as well. Previously, it was a software known as Concept Systems Global Map software, which is referenced within the paper. Today, it's been upgraded and is now called Group Wisdom. Now, this can be used in workshop, face-to-face, or online, or both. Or in fact, as Megan has used it recently, over the phone with participants who have, through disability, and been unable to use the online method. Next slide, please. David?
Okay, so there's 6 steps to group concept mapping. You can see them numbered out here, and you need to go through them in this particular format. So you need to prepare, you have to generate ideas. Then what you do is you structure statements. Then you get into concept mapping analysis. It produces a series of maps for you, which you can then interpret, and ultimately then you can use it. And we've used this to generate a number of products. One is the FRAIT, which is the Family Resilience Assessment Instrument and Tool, and that's used by all health visitors in Wales in their everyday working with families. So it's a way of working that you can actually move forward and generate other forms of outputs. Next slide. You need to have a facilitator, somebody knows their way around the process. You need to have a study team. You need to have a group of people that you can bounce ideas off. And when it comes to analysis, you need to have people that can participate with you in working out what's the best level of analysis for your maps. And you'll see that as we go on through. When you're setting up, you need to include some demographics questions. And this is to help you with your analysis so that you can start to ask meaningful questions of the data and structure it in the way that you want. It's most important that you develop a single focus prompt, and this has to be clear and unambiguous, and we'll come on to that shortly. You need to identify 2 rating scales. You can use more, but it gets more complicated, so we would advise you to stick with 2. And you can see there that the number of participants can be quite small, between 8 and 15, and obviously you need to get ethical approval. Next slide. So what you can start to see here then is the demographic questions. And what we wanted to know here is, well, where did people work? How long have they been in their role? What did their role consist of? Were they paid or were they unpaid? What sort of organization? And these questions then are used to analyze the concept mapping data. Next slide. So here's an example of the focus prompt, and you can see it has to be straightforward and unambiguous, and it has to be framed as though the person is saying it to themselves. So it's to help me in my social prescribing role, my learning needs are, and then they need to identify one thing that put at the end of it. So you've got some examples here of actual statements that people generated. Now, you can see the second one down, it says, has the drive and the tenacity to see changes through for people. That actually is 2 statements. So later on, what we'd have to do is to split this into 2 separate things. And so there's a process that you need to go through to make sure that you're getting clear and clean data. Next slide, and over to you, Carolyn.
So in the paper that we wrote and in the study that we completed, the statements were then structured into 5 constructs: compassion, interpersonal relationships, socioeconomic disadvantage, networking, and monitoring data. And you can see examples here, the statements included within each of those clusters. For example, compassion, statement 12 and 15 has the drive and tenacity to see change through for people, understanding people will not change to help themselves until they're ready to help themselves. So you can see how different those statements are. Now, what's important to note is that during the GCM process, within the original study, we had 18 participants, and who generated 85 statements. And as you can see, the statements can be rather large, and so they do need cleaning. And so we ended up, as we divided statements and cleaned the statements, we ended up with 120 statements in total. Next slide, please. So after the brainstorming, after the grouping of the statements into those named clusters, and each participant is asked to name their clusters and how they group their statements. The process takes us through a ratings phase, where participants are asked to rate each statement. And on this occasion, it was on 2 scales. You can use up to 3 scales, but on this occasion, it was 2 scales. Usually, the first one is of importance, and on the second scale that was used on this occasion was availability. So, for example, you can see there an in-depth knowledge of services available in the area, place in which my work is based, so that I can refer people accurately into the service if required, is on a rating scale of 1 to 5. And individuals there, you can see, have there are examples of how these statements have been rated. Next slide, please. So the analysis. So there are 3 steps for the analysis, and apart from the when we're doing some a statistical analysis for the demographics, we go into these 3 steps, that of creating a similarity matrix, which is formed from the sort information from all the participants. If you recall how we grouped and we sort and we labelled. The second one is conducting the multidimensional scaling point map, which develops a map of points representing each statement. Analysis is created from 2 coordinates for each statement, plotted on an XY axis. And hierarchical cluster analysis, cluster maps. There are different types of maps which are produced, and this uses the sort pile label analysis, and also develops bridging and anchoring analysis, and also pattern matching and go zones, which can be used, as we did in this occasion, to develop the learning needs framework, particularly the go zone analysis. Next slide, please. So here we have an example of a map. This is a point map, 120 statement point map following the multidimensional scaling. And you can see here how we look at where you can see, for example, 102 point statement there. And if you look at 84, they're wide apart because they haven't been either sorted together regularly or not sorted together at all. Whereas 103 and 102 have been sorted regularly together and closely together. And you can see the patterns around the map, which you can see clusters of where those statements have been sorted together. For example, 21, 20, all around that area there is an example of where that's happened. Next slide, please. And here's the cluster map with the labels from the participant sorting exercise. And you can see where we've got these clusters where they developed. If you recall just now where I mentioned 20 and 21 are within the socioeconomic disadvantage cluster. And you've also got the networking cluster there, monitoring data, interpersonal relationships, and the compassion cluster there. And there's a reason why socioeconomic disadvantage and monitoring data are as far apart as they are. It's because of the way that these have been, the statements have been grouped. Next slide, please. David?
Reese, I'm not seeing any slide at the moment.
Do you want me to take it? I can see it.
Yeah, would you? I can't see anything.
Yeah, okay. So step 5 then, interpreting the maps. Now, I spoke earlier on about the 2 rating scales, and this one is the cluster rating map for importance. So we can see how important the cluster of the statements were in for the participants. So you see here with the layers, you can see there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers indicates with compassion. The compassion in fact was the most important cluster for the participants. And likewise, monitoring data was the least important cluster. Next slide. Thank you. So here we have the go zone. And if you could recall, I said that this is a really important map for us because it taught us what was important and what was available. What statements were important to the individual participants and which ones were available. But most importantly, those in that orange section that you can see, those that were important but not available or least available. And so you can imagine for those in the green zone where they're most important and available, then, you know, as a commissioner, I won't be so worried about that group of cluster of statements. But the orange ones are where I'd be concerned and perhaps looking to commission learning for those people undertaking this role. Next slide, please. David?
Thank you.
You see that?
So this is where we can come to use the findings. We followed this up with the World Cafe event, and that allowed us to ask participants where in a timeline would these particular interventions need to take place. So we could start to get a sense of how you build a curriculum and where you'd introduce particular aspects. We could then start to build a framework of social prescribers' learning needs, and then this could be the basis then for looking at education, training, and assessment. So it can be used by commissioners to look at what they want to commission. It can be used by educators to look at how they build a curriculum. And you can also use it then to see how you'd assess students for competence in terms of their learning and their learning needs. So it's really useful in that respect. But it's also is important to find out what's not available. There's no point repeating something that's already there. This allowed us to say, look, this is important. It's not there. This is something you might want to consider commissioning. Next slide.
Now it's your turn, Megan.
Yeah, next slide, please. So you hopefully have all had an email with this link. I think we're going to have the link appearing up on the screen as well, where it says join the activity. So you can click onto that. The login should be the email address that you signed up to the workshop with, and your password is there on screen, HCRW1 exclamation mark. At the moment, there will be 2 activities available for you. The first one is participant questions, and I can see a number of people have already started to complete that, which is great. And then the second one will be the brainstorming. So if I just explain that, we can have the next slide, please. So we've come up with this focus prompt to get you to test the software out yourselves. It is, in order to make a difference, health and care research needs to. So our group of group concept mapping team in University of South Wales came up with a few statements to get you started. The aim is to avoid duplicating any statements. Obviously, in a normal scenario, we'd have time to sort through these, but for the sake of the workshop, if you can really avoid duplicating, that's great. And if you could just add a single statement that answers that question for you, that answers that prompt, we can then move on to the next stage. So we'll give you a couple of minutes now to do those participant questions and the brainstorming, and then we'll move on to the sorting. Thanks. If you have any questions or tech problems, put them in the chat or the ask a question section, and we can resolve those for you. Yeah, and I think it's in the join the activity. You should have a green button at the bottom in the center of the screen. If not, I'll type it in the chat now.
When you're in the brainstorming, you should be able to see that some statements have been generated. One of them's called embrace modern tools that populations use, e.g. social media, etc. Second one, involve public and patient in all steps. 3, be rigorous. So you'll see there are 7 at the moment in total. So please feel free to add a statement.
And when you're done with that task, there should be a finish button at the top right to say that you've completed it. We'll just keep an eye on those numbers.
I can see that 16 people have completed the participant questions.
I think it's useful to say at this moment in time that when we do this for real, people get about 2 weeks to have a go at this. And so they can come into it using the Martini principle at any time, any place, anywhere. It allows them to have a think, come back into things, and they can keep generating statements as and when the earth moves for them.
I can see you've been very active. We've now got 37 statements.
Brilliant.
Just give it one more minute. We wanted up to about 50 statements, so feel free to keep adding. We've got 40 at the moment.
Carolyn, do you want to mention something about some bilingual statements?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So we've, as mentioned, we've used this on numerous occasions, and most recently we used it to understand what the role of the third and voluntary sectors were in in supporting individual well-being post COVID and Brexit. And during that time of developing the study, it became apparent that we did need to do this in Welsh and in English, and it is possible to do that within the software, but there are some restrictions, and so the restrictions are in where the instructions, when you do the instructions, and so we had to limit the instructions in and change the instructions slightly to accommodate 2 languages, which is when we're going forward to do some work with family resilience in India in the next year. This will pose us with a problem. However, saying that, individuals were able to participate with by developing statements in Welsh, and we were able then to provide translation of those statements for others when we were going through the grouping and the rating. But that meant that you could see all the way through that piece of work that we did for the WCVA that it enabled people to express themselves within their language of choice.
That's great. So I'm just going to close the brainstorming now, and then Carolyn or David, if one of you could explain the sorting stage just while I open it up.
Yeah.
Great. I think it's the next slide, please.
David?
Okay, so as with most things these days, this originally started off as an analog process. And back in the old days, you'd have bits of paper with the statements on, and you would sort them into piles. What the software does is turns that into a digital process. So what we want you to do here is to sort the ideas into groups that make sense to you. There are some restrictions. You need to have a minimum of 1 statement in a pile, and ideally you want to have more than 1 statement in a pile as well, otherwise it gets really complicated. What you then need to do is to give the piles that you create a name, and you put a label on that, and then what the software will do is look at the most commonly used labels and it will generate a meta label for all of the piles that ultimately are produced. When you're having a go at the sorting, it doesn't matter if you don't manage to sort them all, but we're trying to get about 75% of the statements so we can do some analysis. So look at the statements that are there. As you put them through, think to yourself, what are they trying to say there? Is there a label that I could stick that under, that I could hang these different sorts on? And then we'll go from there. Anything you want to add, Carolyn?
Yeah, just to say that depending on which what your device you're using, whether it's a phone or whether it's a tablet or laptop or PC, the presentation is slightly different. For a laptop PC, it may be a drag and drop, where you just lift the statement and drop it into, and it creates a group for you. Whereas on the phone, it's slightly different, and that you're asked to label, and then you move the statements into that labeled group. You may also see a slight difference in the telephone presentation. Some participants talk about seeing a grey area slightly covering the participants, and you have to scroll up sometimes to come out of that grey area.
Thanks, Carolyn. So I've now opened the sorting stage and also our 2 rating scales. So you might need to refresh your Group Wisdom screen, and then you should be able to access those 3 stages. I'll quickly explain the rating scales now, and then you can just do them at your own pace. So if I could have the next slide, please. So you will then, once you've done your sorting, you'll need to click Finish. As David mentioned, if we can get 75% of the statements sorted at least, then that means that we can include them in the analysis. And then you'll be asked to rate each of the statements on 2 scales. So one is importance, 1 being the least important, 5 being the most important, followed by a rating scale of how likely it is to happen. So 1 being least likely and 5 being most likely. And you can do those at your own pace, but as long as you click Finish, then we can approve your data once you've completed. Thank you. And I've just seen there was a question on the Q&A from Una saying, is there a limit to the number of statements that participants in research studies can add? So there isn't a limit. I recently completed a group concept mapping study where I had 363 statements generated from the brainstorming stage. However, as you'll see when you get onto the stages 2 and 3, that's an awful lot for participants to kind of do the sorting and the rating. So we tend to do data cleaning, and we use a method called QUIC, which is keywords in context, to narrow those number of statements down and synthesize them into a group of statements. We tend to go between 100 and 125 as an absolute maximum. Otherwise, it just becomes too unmanageable for the participants.
It might be worth saying about the minimum number of statements, Megan.
Yeah, Carolyn, do you want to say? I'm not sure about the minimum.
Well, the minimum number of statements it is dependent upon the question that you ask, and obviously this the group that you're working with. But it's desirable to have at least around 50 statements. You can have less, but around about that number would it is preferable. But to maximum, maximum we've gone is 125. As Megan said, that is really difficult for then people to work through the rating scales, especially if you've got 3 maximum rating scales as well, where we have done that on one occasion, had 3 rating scales, but you've got to think about the impact that has on the individual, and people get bored of actually doing more than 2 rating scales at times. And you can see the slope down on participation, if you're not careful, if you overdo it. So Megan, you've used 3, haven't you? Used it with our most recent study.
Yes, we used 3, and there was some feedback that it was too many. So yeah, it depends on your population. We had a lot of participants as well, so it worked quite well in that setting, and people were very interested in the topic. So I think it's one of those things that you can be really flexible with, and that's where, you know, in the stage one, where your preparation stage, you discuss those things with your study team and you make those decisions based on your questions.
So the other question that we're often asked as well is the number of participants. So the number of participants, a minimum number is anything between 8 and 15. Kane and Trokim advise that you wouldn't want to have less than 8 participants in the study. To be honest with you, 18 is the lowest we've a number of participants we've had, and that's within this particular study. The most we've had, and Megan, that was our most recent study, wasn't it? Whereby, how many did you have in with the wellbeing study?
We had 93 uploaded onto the software. There is a limit of 100 people who can participate in the sorting and rating stages, but you can have as many as you want in the brainstorming. And the other thing it might be useful to say, Carolyn, is about adding statements from the literature.
Yes, and we do that very often. For example, in our one of our most recent studies with on our HEFCU study, whereby we've been looking at exploring the well-being of students in higher education, and having generated the statements in the brainstorming, we then added the statements from the international literature in order to ensure that the capture of the statements was quite robust going forward into the sorting, and we were able to map those statements across to the international literature, and which was very useful because the participants themselves had missed out some important points around domestic abuse and that sort of thing, and drugs and alcohol.
We had a similar picture when we were doing the quality indicators for health visiting, and we did that live at a conference. So we had a finite amount of time, longer than we've got today, but we were able to move rapidly through the process, but not miss things out. So we incorporated a series of statements from the literature, and then the health visitors who were present at the conference added that as well. And that's also now in the public domain, so you can follow that one up if you're interested, or get in touch with us for any further details or information.
Just a reminder that when you're completed the sorting, or you've got to around 75% of the statements, so about 42 or something statements, to just press that finish button at the top, so we know that you've completed. In a second, maybe about 1 minute more, we'll be asking you to move on to the rating scales as well, just so we can do some live analysis at the end to show you the sorts of things that you get from this kind of activity.
Examples of other studies that we're actually about to deliver are the one is for the impacts study, which is the evaluation of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, being led by Professor Mark Llewellyn. We're conducting a GCM study on the characteristics of multi-agency working post the Act. And that's going to be an all-Wales study, which will be commencing shortly. Another study is, again, a repetition of the HEFCU study, which we did in higher education in Wrexham, and we're repeating that in USW to see whether there's a difference between the universities, but also we conducted the original Wrexham study actually during COVID, and we're now doing it this term during different conditions.
We've also got a number of PhD students who are using GCM, and so one of them is looking at the notion of compassion, and another one is looking at social prescribing and roles. And so we're starting to build quite a wide range of topics and bringing people on. So we're hoping to get quite a few outputs from this in the not too distant future.
So we'll close the sorting stage in a minute. If you could just press the finish button, then we can see that you've completed that, and then move on to the rating scales. The rating scales don't have a minimum number of statements required to complete, so you can just do as many of those as you can in the time you've got. And just so you're aware of the process that goes on backstage, is we then review each of the participants' statements and their sorting. So we check that the sorting is done in kind of compliance with the instructions, and we check that the ratings, for example, someone hasn't just written 1 1 1 1 1 or 1 2 3 or so on. So we check that the data is valid.
I should mention something about the stress value. That's how we an indicator of the relationship between the data input, the similarity matrix, and the distance on the map. And we check the stress value in order to see whether or not there is a good relationship. And on this occasion, in the study that we conducted for the learning needs framework, the stress value was 0.3402, which was within the acceptable range of 0.205 and 0.365. Always good to check to make sure that things are progressing, and that the data that you've got is good.
So I'll close that that sorting activity now, and then you can just move on to the two rating scales, please.
For those of you who want to learn more about group concept mapping, please feel free to contact us at any time. We're always happy to have a conversation about it. The way we manage group concept mapping at the University of South Wales is through a large site license, whereby we're able to provide members of staff a license, but we actually keep central control so that we're able to have the main administrator is able then to help the individual who is going through the group concept mapping process, so that they've always got support with them, and you're able to check through any issues or problems that they may have. Which is quite rare, really. There's some excellent resources on the group concept mapping site, and through each stage, there is some written resources and also video resources which take you through it step by step. We also have at the University of South Wales a group concept mapping group, which we meet on a regular basis to discuss all the projects that we are managing, and also to talk through the method in detail. Also important to say that having the steering group is essential throughout the GCM process. As with any consensus method, the steering group members can help with map interpretation and commenting on findings. And as we go through the live analysis now with Megan, you'll see how important that is.
And I guess it's important to say that the stakeholder group will include your PPI rep, and they've proved invaluable for us in the past in helping sensitize us to the data that emerges. So if you're thinking about running something like GCM, it doesn't mean that you can't include a PPI. In fact, they've got a very real strong role to play.
The other thing that we've noticed is that it doesn't matter how old the individual is, when they're participating. Megan had, I believe, top end was a 90-year-old in the last study, Megan.
I had 3 90-year-olds actually.
3 90-year-olds, which was great. And as I mentioned earlier on, it doesn't matter if they're not able to participate online. We are able to talk them through the process and to ensure that they're able to participate. David mentioned earlier on we had a study on compassion on working a PhD student working with Torvine Council and mapping out the concept of compassionate care. In order to ensure that that was a participant led process, Molly, our student, she actually interviewed very, very frail older people living in care homes in order to ensure that they were able to participate in the brainstorming stage. And so that the actual process and the study started with them, which was they were really keen to get involved, although they were very frail. We actually lost 2 of them during this study, but they were very keen to make sure that their voice was heard.
Okay, we'll just give you 1 more minute on the rating task. I appreciate this is pretty rapid. Obviously, in a normal GCM, you would have a lot more time, but we just were hoping to be able to show you a bit of what the analysis can produce and some relevant findings.
In addition to generating concept maps, you can also use the GCM software to evaluate projects. And if this is something that you think you might be interested in, then get in touch and we can talk you through the process of how you use it for evaluation purposes.
Okay, if you can just click complete on your rating wherever you are, even if you've just done 1 on the second scale. If anyone has any questions and if you want to ask them now, I'm just going to quickly go through and make sure I approve all of the data, and then we can do the live analysis.
A study like the one that we've mentioned in the paper normally takes about 9 weeks to complete. So you've had a really rapid introduction to the method. Sue's just mentioned that she's had some problems with multitasking, and she's either listening or she can do the the participation within the study. So Sue, happy to talk you through the process again in the future, but also this is being recorded, so you will have an opportunity to revisit the workshop in the next few weeks.
It'd be put up live after October the 7th.
And what we can do on October the 7th is open the activities back up. We won't be able to open brainstorming, but we can open sorting and rating just for you to play around with it. Barbara, sorry, I've just seen your comment. You will be locked out now because we have closed the activity just so we can do the analysis. So I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me a second. Carolyn or David, can you just let me know when people can see the screen?
Okay.
Reese, is there a way that we can link that?
You can make that into a larger.
Yeah, so if we can take down the presentation.
That's it. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So
Barbara, just to say that Megan's taking us through a bit of the analysis now.
So our stress value is within the limits that Carolyn mentioned earlier. So we'll accept the results. We can see the point map. So we've got a cluster up here. We've got a cluster down here. And you can edit your map and change the colors and so on. So we'll create some clusters. So they give you the options from between 4 and 15 clusters based on the sorting that everyone did. So we can compare those different clusters. So you've got the 4 model there, then it splits into 5, 6, and so on. So we'll go with a 5 cluster model just for today, but obviously in an ideal world, you would review each of those, you would review the points within them, and so on. So, but here is the kind of thing you get. So we've got 5 clusters. We've got one about diversity, one about the process, one about being well conducted, another about impact, and a final one about patient involvement. So we'll set that as our cluster solution. And what we can do is create a cluster rating map. So we will look at those clusters. You might remember it's the one that Carolyn showed earlier to show which are the more important clusters. You can see here that patient involvement was rated as the highest, most important cluster, followed by impact, and the other 3 were rated as less important. And if we go over here, we can see the values and so on. And you can also see, bear with me a second, I'm just hoping to show some of the points on here. Here we go. So you can see that a number of these points were in the patient involvement. So you can actually look at the type of statement that is within that cluster. So things like highlight unmet need or an impact, address a real need, and so on. Translate into policy in the process. We can do the same cluster rating map with the how likely it is to happen map. And so here you can see a bit of a difference. So where patient involvement was clearly a most important one, actually being well conducted is rated as the most likely to happen, followed by impact and patient involvement, and the diversity and process are still are rated as less likely to happen. So the other things that we can create, sorry, my screen is frozen, bear with me a second. So we can create the go zone quadrant, which is, you may remember the diagram with the 4 boxes, yellow, green, blue and orange. And so on this we can compare importance with how likely it is to happen. So we'll just load that up. So you can see moderate correlation here, but statements like have a clear strategy and plan, they're deemed to be very likely to happen and also very important. Whereas a statement like 37 is deemed as important, sorry, not so important, but likely to happen, so being open about who is funding the research. And then this yellow quadrant will be the interesting one. It will be things that are deemed as important but unlikely to happen. So involve individuals from diverse communities and perspectives, translate into policy, make sure findings are accessible to all, ensure research findings are disseminated and implemented, and so on. So these might be kind of areas that need addressing in health and care research. Carolyn or David, do you want to speak to this at all?
I think this is quite useful for people who are constructing policy and then are looking at mechanisms to make sure that things follow through. It actually gives you some evidence to take things forward. I think also for researchers, it allows us to look at if these are the areas that people are saying are less likely to happen, we can start to work out, well, what mechanisms can we do to make sure that it happens? Carolyn, do you want to say anything about that?
I was just going to say that, you know, in answering the question, in order to make a difference, health and care research needs to. You can see by clustering the maps, we can start to get an answer, and also by using the rating scales, we can also get an answer to that question.
Yeah, the final report that I can show you quickly is a pattern match. And so you may remember that you completed the some demographic questions at the end. So we can compare on importance what different people wrote. So we can compare, for example, your role in health and care research is as a researcher. We had 11 participants as researchers. And just for the sake of this task, we'll just choose everyone else to be non-researchers, but what you can do is compare, you can compare a number of different things. So we can compare practitioners and policymakers and researchers, but we'll put the rest as non-researchers and we'll create. So this is a relative, oh, sorry, I'm not sure if you're, there we go, sorry. So this is a relative pattern match. So it shows that being well conducted was rated as the least important for both of the groups, and patient involvement was rated as most important for the 2 groups. But then there are some differences. So both diversity and group and slightly more important for our non-researcher group. And we can then run t-tests and statistical analysis to work out whether these are significant differences. Do either of you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, it's really useful. For example, in the WCVA study, we looked at whether there was a difference between rurality and urban participants, and we could see a slight difference in their responses. So it's all dependent. This particular tool it very much depends on the demographic questions that you ask right at the beginning. and you can use those to then come up with reports such as this.
Can I pick up something that Mary Lynch has put up in the chat box, which is about could it be applied to health economics? Mary, as you know, I'm not a health economist, so this is an idiot speaking from that position. But I think if we're starting to look at the notion of value, I can imagine how you could start to get some evidence about how different groups value certain aspects, and whether you could then use that within your health economics analysis. Obviously, I don't know, but I'm sure that you could. But I think you can apply it in many ways. It just depends on what's the topic that you wish to inquire into and the questions that you're asking.
Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen now. We'll just check if there's any other questions. Kate's asked, how were those clusters labelled? So the system looks at all of the labels that all of the participants gives and picks a label. In a normal scenario, the research team would go through each of those alternative labels. They'd look at the statements and check whether those statements are represented in that label. They might select another statement label, or they might say none of those are appropriate, but this one is. And that would be a decision with the steering group that everyone would agree upon.
And sometimes there are, on the odd occasions, we do get participants who don't like to label things, and you can see no label one coming up. And it's really important to go through, as Megan said, all the statements to check through how the labels have been generated and which order they're generated in, so that you can use the words of the participants throughout the whole process. But there are times when that doesn't work and doesn't seem to work, and that's where the steering group is really, the advisory group that you have type of group is really important. And particularly when you're doing something from a professional perspective, for example, when we did the work with health visiting, it was important to have members that were health visitors as well as managers in the group, to ensure that the labels were appropriate and would have been useful for the health visiting community.
Can I pick up on Sue Pierce's chat comment, which is about expert elicitation? I think you're right, Sue. And the beauty of this, of course, is that you can use it on a global basis. The software will allow you to use other languages, provided, of course, you can speak and read them. But because of its asynchronous nature, it means you can work with people in the Anglosphere, for example, in Canada, the States, Australia, New Zealand, and you can actually get a global perspective on something. Clearly, you decide what their expertise is and how they work on that. But yeah, in many respects, the sky's the limit.
That's great. I think we're out of time now. So just to say thanks very much for joining. Any comments about the workshop would be greatly appreciated. If we could just go to the last slide, Reese. We've got our email address there, which is whisper@southwales.ac.uk. So we'd be grateful to have any feedback. And if you are interested in taking any group concept mapping projects forward, then get in touch as well.
Thanks very much, everyone, for your comments and your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Diolch.